Okay, so creating accessible illustrations. This is not be all and end all. This is just an approach to sort of good practice for creating accessible illustrations. The themes in here align to what you'll see when we get our standard out as well. So this sort of constitutes guidance that aligns with the standard that we hope to bring to you all in the near future. Okay. Oh, hang on. I've just got to figure out how to change the slide. There we go. Got it. Okay. So illustration is essentially a visual narrative that runs alongside a data concept or an idea or a work of information. So it is not an isolated creative output. It can be artistic and it can be art, and art can be illustrative, but the key there is context. So the context for us is the archaeological record here. The illustration that we create is to help understand elements and really complex ideas around this idea that we can look at mud and see past societies. It's really key to understand that it's that context that I think is what makes the illustration. Sorry, I've lost my notes now. Okay, they're on the screen. Apologies. So yeah, illustration is there to help understand these complex and difficult to understand ideas, which fundamentally means that we are interpreting. So we need to be confident in the information we're trying to portray to get the idea across to whichever audience it is that we are explaining this archaeological narrative to. So the first thing that I really wanted to underpin is that without a clear brief or a clear idea of what it is you're trying to put through, you're not going to be able to create a good, accessible illustration because you can't interpret something you don't understand. So yes, the very first thing you need to do is to be thinking about the brief or that's been presented to you. This is the point where you are thinking about the final outputs as well. So, you know, who is it for? Where's it going? What are you going to do with it? And all of that needs to be apparent to you, I think, at the point before you even start illustrating. So really fundamentally is understanding the brief is how you move forward into creating accessible illustrations. That's also, for me, an idea that the illustration, while it is part of this wider context, a really good illustration or suite of illustrations will allow you to inherently understand the information that's been presented without having to do any hard work of reading anything at all, ideally. So if we can get away with not reading the books, if you can get through a book of archaeology and you understand without having read a single word that what the site is and what it's about, then that's the mark of a really strong illustrative narrative. And that's really the standard to aim for, I think. Okay, so yeah, we need to establish this narrative. So I know that some of the illustrations we do are standalone pieces of work, but quite often they're linked into wider things like reports, like monographs, like publications, or even websites and story maps these days. So I think it's really important for the reader that you are establishing this narrative. And the way that that makes sense for all of us is to sort of zoom in on the details. You're probably all intimately familiar with the idea of a figure one and with your site location on a map with the UK on it, and then you're getting down and through to individual features. The idea is that there shouldn't ever be a jump in the understanding. So you should be able to get from where is this site in the UK to where is this post hole on the site visually through the narrative. So yeah, starting wide out and bringing it down to a singular point of focus is the way to bring the reader's understanding with you. The whole of the narrative should be able to interrelate. So there should be no, as I say, no isolation of where has this pit come from, or where has this post hole come from, or on a poster even, you know, if you've got a very limited idea of where stuff is, there still should be a way to tie it back to the understanding of the reader as to how they've arrived here. So to do this in a wider context, it's really useful to think in a sort of linear fashion. So whether that be by looking at a site by phase, you know, building through time, or if it's literally a linear site, a sort of long thin one, then it might be useful to bring the reader along from site to site. But the idea is that you can progress along this path and try not to loop back too many times so that you don't lose the reader's understanding. Okay, I've just realized why the notes aren't showing. It's because it's only moving through on the screen and not on this. It's not particularly helpful. Okay, so in my head, I have 3 A's that I try and aim for whenever I'm creating an illustration. And as an illustration manager, it's what I'm also one of the standards that I'm holding my team's work to. So technical illustrations, they can be about very boring and non-interesting subject matter, but that doesn't mean they can't be excellent and useful illustrations in their own right. So I would always say that illustration should be attractive, accurate, and accessible. And I'll break those down in a second. Okay, so the other thing about attractive and accurate is that if you manage to hit both of those, you're already starting to feed into the accessibility of the illustration. Oh, no, hang on. Still can't figure out how to move the slide on and move the notes on. Okay, so attractive. Attractive is obviously pretty subjective, but there are some fundamental principles around creating attractive illustration. One of the simplest ways to create an attractive illustration is to keep it clean and keep it simple. Overloading loads of information is going to be difficult to the reader to understand what's going on, but it also it creates mess, a visual mess. It creates muddying and obfuscation of the information you're trying to impart. So clean and simple is really a really good principle to stand by. It's very much a case of less is more. If you have a lot of information to impart in one illustration, then actually, if it's too much, then maybe it's better to put it into 2 illustrations or 3 illustrations. You don't gain anything from overloading illustrations. I know that people might talk about page count, etc., but if you have to put more effort into explaining what the illustration is showing you, then the illustration loses its value, it loses its worth. So yeah, think about the amount of data and information that you're trying to impart to the viewer and try and compartmentalize it so that it's more understandable for the reader who's trying to follow the context alongside this visual narrative. Consistency is really key in creating attractive figures. So that really applies to everything. A consistent use of fonts, consistent use of colors, even down to consistency in where you're placing your north arrow, for example, or your scale bar. In terms of the reader being able to readily and easily access that information, if it's consistently presented in the similar sort of place as far as possible, it really helps them to understand the framework of the data that you're trying to impart. So yeah, be consistent. And this is why organizations develop house styles, for example. So a key part of attractiveness is how it looks. So, you know, even down to color choices, there's there's good options and bad options. I'm sure we've all seen bad options. So I'll talk more about colour under the accessibility bit, but it definitely comes under attractive as well. I've put in brackets there global conventions. This is, I'll just flick back and forwards, the idea that there are bits of information that transcend our local conventions. So, for example, water is blue. And thank you, Leslie, for the illustration here. It's a really simple concept, but everyone understands that inherently water is blue. So if you can see how quickly and easily you can cite the location on the right against the river of the Ouse in York, obviously, simply because it's blue. So thinking about global conventions and the way that people perceive colour and have already got a subconscious bias towards colour is really useful when you're thinking about how to illustrate. Think about where your illustration is going to go. So your illustration is going to be part of a wider set of context almost all of the time. So very occasionally they will sit by themselves and you've got everything self-contained, but quite often we're illustrating to sit in reports, as I say, or on posters or in books. So in terms of creating that attractive appeal, if you've got illustrations in a book, for example, it's not just one illustration in a book, it's a suite of illustrations in a book, and it's going to relate to the other content. So thinking about how that illustration is going to sit with both the written content and the other illustrations is really key. So thinking about things like, if you've got columns, will your information sit across two columns? Will it fit in one? If it fits in one, is that better? Will that be easier for it to integrate with the content, the written content, and therefore to flow in line with that content? So yeah, it's definitely worth thinking about. And then just again, under attractive, there are principles of good design that definitely apply to illustration. It's much more difficult for us to do, but even in terms of laying out your page, you can think about things like the rule of thirds and the golden ratio and other principles of good design, like using space appropriately. Having an awareness of these principles will really ultimately lend you to being a better illustrator and designer. Let's face it, a lot of our roles incorporate design as well. Okay, so accurate is not the artistic part of our work, but it is fundamentally incredibly important. As I've said before, our role as archaeological illustrators is to contribute to the understanding of the archaeological record, which means that if we are presenting it, it needs to be accurate and it needs to be true, and we need to be able to be accountable for the data that we're presenting. So yeah, falsification, I mean, there's fudging and there's falsification. So we're all familiar with fudging, I'm sure. There's definitely a pit on site and it's definitely near to this other pit, but no one actually remembered to survey it in. Sometimes, you have to fudge it in from a photo. But ultimately, we do know that pit exists. And so what we're doing is approximating our best guess of location for it. That's fudging. Falsifying is, there wasn't a pit, but I'm going to say there was a pit, or there was a pit, but I've been asked to take it off the plan because they don't want to talk about it. That's falsification. And that's not that you should ever be asked this by any responsible archaeologist, but we have it as a responsibility to ourselves and to our profession and as members of this professional body to make sure that the information we present is accurate and true and verifiable to the best of our ability. The other elements of accuracy relate to the fact that this illustration or narrative is, as I say, part of the archaeological record, which means that it's likely to end up in an archive. In terms of making sure that it can consistently contribute to the archaeological record, things like your key, your scale, your north arrow, your coordinates are all fundamental to ensuring that the legacy of this interpretation goes forwards and can still be useful, you know, infinite time from now. And then the other element on accuracy is that we do conjectural interpretation. So, you know, for example, on the previous illustration, it's presumed that the road will run across the water. There isn't evidence per se for that, so it's shown as a conjectural element. There's nothing wrong with that. It's inference and it's interpretation, but we just need to be apparent and clear when we don't have anything beyond suggestive evidence. Okay, so 1 and 2, attractive and accessible, all lead up to 3. Attractive and accurate, all lead up to 3. So 3 is accessible. The thing about accessibility is that there is global accessibility, and then there are very specific standards of accessibility for both print and digital outputs. But a lot of the elements that make an illustration or an image accessible are global elements. So I'll go into those in a minute. But you need to consider what you need at the point where you're creating the illustration. Where is it going to be used, and what are the accessibility requirements for those two different things? If you've designed it well, then usually it can be pretty versatile, and you can use your illustration in both a book and on a website, and maybe on a poster and in a leaflet as well. If it's clean, clear, and accurate, then and attractive enough, then you'll be able to use it in multiple ways. But being aware that you might need to adjust it for different outputs is something to be aware of. And finally, accessibility is very much audience dependent. So a lot of the time we're creating very complex interpretations of quite complex things for other people who understand the complexity of it. So a lot of our illustrations are archaeologist to archaeologist. So there's inherent understanding there of what it is we're showing. Other times it will be archaeologist to school child, in which case we can't assume that same level of knowledge. So understanding who the audience is for your illustration is really fundamental to being able to create it accessibly for that intended audience. Oh, this is a bit about accessible. So this is a very lovely and accessible drawing created again by Leslie. Thank you, Leslie. I think I've put this in the wrong place. It was meant to be a bit lower down, so just bear with me while I suss out where I am. Oh yeah, okay. So I'll come back to that in a minute. So there are global accessibility principles, as I've said before. So anytime you're creating an illustration, again, you'll see some of these things actually come from attractive or accurate, because as I said, they build into creating accessible illustration. So again, keeping it clean, using the space available to impart the information you have, and simplifying are all elements that create an attractive illustration, but also create it as an accessible illustration. So I won't say too much more on that. The fonts and labels on our illustrations are something that we can always be aware of. So really tiny font is obviously not very helpful to anyone. Likewise, massive fonts actually can take away from what it is you're trying to show. So there's a balance to be struck there, and I'll talk about the specifics of print and digital in a minute. The other thing about fonts is keeping it simple means not using 43 different fonts in an illustration. It's really useful to be able to use different fonts for different things, but actually trying to keep it simple creates an easier narrative for the reader to understand. So if you're going to use fonts, use them consistently and try not to overcomplicate them. Actually, going back to Leslie's York drawing, it's a really good example. So you can see there's two fonts in this illustration. There's the sans serif for labels, etc. And then there is the serif for the topographic features for the river ooze. And this can be a really useful way to help to create a hierarchy of information, which I will mention again in a second. Color is clearly a huge element of both accessibility but also attractive illustration. So this is where I was going to go to this. It's really worth remembering that not everyone sees color the same way. So this is the output of this illustration as seen by presumably the majority of us, but I think it's about 1 in 12 people don't perceive color in the same way as the majority of us. So for example, if you have red-green color blindness, this is how this same illustration would present to you. Apologies, it's got a bit fuzzy. It's quite hard to get the screenshot out from Illustrator. So yeah, this is deuteranopia, I believe is the technical term. It's one of the red-green color blindnesses. And you can see that the colors that have been chosen already work for someone who can't see color normally. So that's a really good thing to consider when you're creating illustrations. And then the other thing I mentioned already with fonts is hierarchy of information. So when you're looking at a site plan, there are things that are really important and there are things that are less important. So you can help the reader to understand what's important with hierarchy of information by making it clear, essentially. So, you know, if it's a group and it's more important and prominent in the discussion, then you can make that a larger or a bolder font. Context numbers are obviously pretty important. What might be less important, for example, on a section is the orientation or the level, the ground level. So you can start to use the hierarchy of information there by creating different levels of font size, for example, to create an easy readable convention for your reader. So yeah, apologies. I thought I'd put a section drawing in here, but I have not. So I don't know where that went. Okay, accessibility in print. So the colors are already mentioned, but when you are printing, you need to really ideally have an understanding of where your work is being printed and more specifically what on. So in terms of paper quality, etc., it can be really significantly affect your illustration. So ideally, you've got an idea of where it's been printed before you create the illustration, at the very least, what it's going to be printed on. So a really good example is print-on-demand books. They are very cheaply output. They're printed with digital, and they are usually high saturation papers, so ink bleeds into them. This means that if you've got lots of dark colors, they all bleed and bloop together. They appear darker, but conversely, it also means that very light colors seep into the page and become quite hard to see. So you need to be aware of what it is you're printing on. If you're printing on high quality, lovely glossy paper, you've got more freedom of use of choice with your colors, but it is useful to understand that what you're printing on is going to impact the outputs of your illustration. Print color contrast is something that's really important to think about, and again that also ties into the paper that it will be printed on, but fundamentally contrast accessibility is something that's really key in ensuring that your illustrations are as accessible as possible. So not using dark inks on dark backgrounds, for example, or light inks on light backgrounds. In the resources page, I've got a really useful tool which you can input your color values and it will tell you if there's adequate contrast for print or digital. So I will share that with you in a bit. The other thing to remember about print is that there's only, or digital as well actually, but for print, there's only a certain percentage of ink that will actually definitely be definable, visible on your page. And when I talk percentage of ink, I'm sure you're all aware that there are the 4 colors of print, CMYK, and your combined value of saturation, so how much ink from each color, should not ever be below 10%, because it's likely to not be visible on the page. Even higher is a bit better. I tend to not go ever below 15% if I can avoid it, just to ensure that you've got that ability to distinguish what it is you're trying to shade. Again, making best use of the page space and knowing the output is really important for that. So if you know that you're working for a monograph page size, understanding how that page size works and how the text is going to flow through it will really help you to cite the illustration at a size and scale that's appropriate and usable for your audience. And then when you're printing, in general, 6-point is the tiniest font size you can use for anything, but 6-point is really tiny. So be wary of going below that. It's not to say you can never go below that, but it would need to be something that you don't really need people to be able to read or understand. So yeah, that's print illustrations. Digital illustrations, a lot of what we've talked about already applies to these, but the addition of digital illustrations is that if they are being presented on the World Wide Web, then ideally you'd want them to adhere to the w3.org accessibility standards of compliance. I've got the links for this in the back, which I will share. But essentially that is the accessibility standards for the web. And particularly if you work for, if you're doing work for an arm's length body or something, they'll expect that anything you produce is compliant to that level. As an illustrator, you don't necessarily always have to do this, but if you're the person that's responsible for citing your illustration in whatever format it's going into, website, a PDF that's going online, etc., you need to know about these accessibility guidelines. Primarily, they're looking at things like color contrast, again, which will happen in design as well. And then the other key thing is alt text, which is an alternative text for any illustration. It's a little bit of a grey area. Illustrations are obviously a way of presenting data that can't be easily shown through the written word. But even so, if it's going on an online environment, then you'll still need to provide a piece of alt text for that illustration that roughly lets a non-sighted viewer know what the illustration would be showing them. It's very much a checky box exercise as well in terms of search engine optimization, for example, will pick up if images don't have an alt text and will automatically downgrade the rankings of that website as a result. And as I say, if you're doing something for like Historic England, they'll need to have alt text available, or any other arm's length body, or most charities really. So yeah, just to be aware that there may be additional parameters on accessibility around the citing of it, not just the design. Okay, so that's a bit of a nutshell of the things to consider to create an accessible illustration. I've got a list of resources. There's loads of things that can help with this. So I've already shown you the colorblind previewer in Adobe. That's also available sort of online. You can't upload an image like that, but I believe there are other websites where you can upload an image and it will give you the different previews of how something will appear read to colorblind people. Just a quick Google will bring up loads and loads of them. Some of them are subscription, some aren't. There are some really good resources on the palettes that are already colorblind tested. So this is a particularly useful little website which presents 3 different colorblind palettes. Colorblind accessible palettes, which are also reasonably attractive for fully sighted people. So that's really good and useful to check out. Contrast calculators I've already mentioned. So this one here is really good because it does both print and digital. So it will tell you if it's, so you can toggle between print and digital for that one. I haven't found another one for print. So that one's really useful. And then if you have the Adobe account, they've got this contrast analyzer, contrast checker. It also has a colorblind preview where you can look only in isolation at the swatches you've selected, and then you can see what they're going to look like. Worth noting that with the W3 standards, this WCA3, I can't read that. This WCAG is the level of compliance for the accessibility. So you've got AA and AAA. If AAA is the gold standard, and it's what will be the minimum required for some places. There's also AA, which some places will accept, but I've always tried to design to a AAA standard in terms of making sure it's as accessible widely as possible. This is just a little quick thing if you've got Illustrator on where you find the colorblind preview. It's down here under the proof setup in view. And you can see this is the full color version on the right, and this is the colorblind preview version on the left. And so it shows you that live in Illustrator. It's a really useful way to quickly check whether your colors are going to work for someone. You can immediately see how much more similar, quite very visually different colors look if you can't see a red or a green, for example. And then finally, there's this list of references. This is just useful websites, stuff that have got quite good guidance available on accessibility. So this is a W3 standard, particularly on the bit for illustrative outputs. Paul Toll is one of the chaps that's designed a palette, an accessible palette, and his is the one that translates best into CMYK. The others are often more RGB space, so not suitable for print. GovUK have got some really good content and guidance on creating and designing accessible content. It is aimed at arm's length bodies or government bodies, but as they're exhibiting the highest standard of accessibility, it's really just very useful and interesting reading. If you want to learn more about colorblindness, this is a really good resource. It gives you some stats, etc., and some considerations you can put into your design and illustration. And then finally, I've just included this AHI interpretation panel guidance, which is more about design accessibility of interpretation panels, but it's something that I found quite useful to refer to.